terms of closer to a Greek default, and where are we in terms of the EU potentially preparing for that eventuality by bolstering its banking system?
Right, so I believe the EU is in kind of a chicken game with Greece right now. When you look at what the Troika did a year ago when they elected to start buying Greek bonds back in May of 2010, they made an agreement with Greece or asked Greece to engage in an agreement whereby when they have 5 state workers leave or retire, they were to hire only 1 new one. Then they moved that to 10 to 1. And when the Troika got to Greece a few weeks ago, if you remember the day they got there and they left abruptly the next day and the Greek budget minister quit that day, they realized that roughly 18 to 20,000 Greeks had retired, and they had hired 24,000 new ones. So they realized that Greece was taking in all this money and they weren't adhering to the austerity plan. So where we are today, Greece runs a current account deficit, right? They run a fiscal deficit. They have no FX reserves.
Are they going to get the 8 billion euros?
It just doesn't matter. The point being is they're completely broke and they're running deficits. And so what's interesting now is the Troika is playing a game with them, in my opinion. The Greeks are completely out of money today, as far as we're concerned. And the Troika is saying, well, maybe the aid payment will be mid-October, and now you're hearing November. They're forcing Greece to prioritize payments, and they're forcing Greece to almost internally default and figure out who they're going to pay and who they're not going to pay. And you know the labor reserve, they're asking for 30,000 Greeks to be in this reserve. They're asking for 100,000 or 150,000 to be fired. Like, this problem, Greece is spending 15% of its central government revenue on interest. Their interest cost is 4%.
It's unsustainable. Everybody's saying, and many people now, I mean, it seems to be a majority opinion that it is.
Anytime now.
Let's talk a bit, though, about the various things, at least that we've heard, in terms of preparing for the eventuality of that default, whether it's a hard restructuring or not, in terms of the EFSF potentially levering it up, and a number of other plans, at least, that have gotten some lip service of late, whether they actually happen. Are they, in your opinion, things that can be done to so-called put an airbag, if you will, to cushion the fall within the financial system in Europe?
I think there are a few things they can do to delay it a little longer, but when you look back to that much heralded press conference between Sarkozy and Merkel, going into that press conference, Sarkozy was out almost every day prior to the conference saying we need to double the FSF, we need to triple it, we need to make it so much larger so that we can recap the whole banking system. If you remember, in the press conference he said, no, I think it's appropriately sized, because one of his advisors must have tapped him on the shoulder and said, you realize if you double or triple the size of this, that the look-through to France's sovereign position will force a significant ratings downgrade. So he abandoned this.
Explain that to people who may not understand what you're saying. The look-through to their sovereign position may force a downgrade.
Well, basically, if you're going to make an additional commitment to another bailout facility, and then you're on the hook for more sovereign debt. And so your sovereign debt position grows, or your contingent liability position grows, and therefore the ratings agencies look at that and say, well, you just took on more debt yourself. So when you think about the EFSF, and this is one thing that we talk about internally at our firm a lot, how does it exactly work when, let's say in the first EFSF bond issuance, you have Portugal, Ireland, and Greece as recipients, and everyone else is a guarantor. Well, in the next iteration, you have one of the guarantors being a recipient.
For example, so, Spain or Italy.
Spain or Italy, or I mean, there's so many others that can be in that.
So how does that work?
Well, it doesn't work. I mean, my point being is you can't have different tranches of EFSF debt out there where one has one specific group of recipients and guarantors, and the next one has a new recipient that was a guarantor. I mean, when you think about this, how many real creditor nations are there in Europe? There are almost none. Everyone's a debtor.
What they're trying.
Who?
Well, Germany.
Germany's not a creditor nation.
Well, I mean, they are.
Germany is 80% debt to GDP, and they haven't recapped their banks. We hold them out to be this island of fiscal solitude, and they're not. Right? Germany has defaulted twice in the last 100 years. So when you look at this situation,
they didn't partake in quite the same bubble making that we did, certainly here, or that other nations did. They didn't lever up to the same extent that many of the other nations did. They're on balance sheet, 80% sovereign debt to GDP, and they haven't recapped their banks. Right, okay? They got a pretty decent economy too, though.
My point being, very simply, that no matter how you look at this new magical facility that we're talking about, the money has to come out of more borrowing. So we're trying to add more debt to a leverage problem.
Crisis.
And now we're talking about levering the new debt to solve a levered debt problem. And when you think about it just practically, when you issue this bond and you have recipients and guarantors, and you have guarantors turning into recipients, it breaks down. So the circular reference is what ends up breaking this situation down. And I just don't think many people have thought that all the way through.
So where do we go from here? You know, in terms of global leverage, of course, which continues to go up, the socialization of losses that we took in the '08 period, certainly here and in Europe as well, have ballooned those public balance sheets, as you say.
Right.
If more debt doesn't solve a debt crisis, what is going to solve a debt crisis?
Well, I mean, you have to restructure the debts. So when you look at the world, this is really important. From 2002 to 2011, global credit market debt, so that's sovereign debt, consumer debt, and corporate debt, so you add all the debt that's out there, has gone from 80 trillion to 200 trillion. It's grown at 12% a year. Real GDP globally has grown at 4% a year. So debt growing at 12 and GDP growing at 4 doesn't work for very long. So today, the globe is 345, 350% total credit market debt to GDP globally. Whereas you make an analogy back to the Great Depression when the U.S. in call it the early 30s, mid 30s, we were 225% total credit market debt to GDP. We're now 350 globally. Right. And what you're seeing is when you start to see debts restructure, it's going to be very difficult to have them not all restructure simultaneously. And what Rogoff tells you is sovereign defaults happen in clusters, and that's what's likely to happen. Whether the people that are engaged in this process or not want it to happen, it's going to happen.
You don't believe that there is some sort of a solution ultimately that the political leaders within Europe can come up with to both keep the EU together, bail out the banks, and cushion a significant blow that would come from a Greek default?
I think there's one question that either delays the inevitable for a while or the inevitable happens much sooner. It's, does Germany go all in? Does Germany decide, well, we've looked at the math problem, or we have a moral obligation post-World War II to save the periphery, and I personally believe that Germany won't go all in.
Why don't you believe that?
We've polled the German population. We've talked to a number of people, let's say in the upper ranks of that country, and I believe in the end they realize that if they lend into the profligacy, that the money that they lend in, they're going to lose 70 or 80% of. And I think that
they've benefited from the euro. There's no doubt about that.
They have, but you know, would you rather be the country that has a really strong currency and the ability to recap your banks while the rest of the people in a much worse scenario, or would you rather be in the much worse scenario with everyone else? I mean, how many of your fiscally irresponsible relatives would you go joint and several with on your personal balance sheet? I don't know too many people that would sign on.